Ladies and gentlemen, when I was the Employment Minister in 2005, I released a report which was entitled Workforce Tomorrow. It outlined the challenges and opportunities of population impact with a predicted 195,000 shortfall of workers and the dependency ratio between the proportion of the population aged 65 to the working age population increasing from 19% in 2002, 36% in 2036. Just recently I asked my department to revisit those figures because that report's about a decade out of date now, and to look at what the available data shows and whether or not there's been changes over the past 10 years. And it's revealed something which is essentially positive. Successive governments have committed to policies and programs that have mitigated the risk of a rapidly ageing population, some of which were difficult and controversial measures at the time. During that time, changes to the retirement income system, participation requirements for specific income support groups, the increase in migration intake and technological advances have helped reduce the severity of the impact of an ageing population more than it was predicted a decade ago. Because of these far-sighted reforms, we now expect that the labour force will grow by 220,000 people per year over the decade from 2020, and the dependency ratio will rise to 30% by 2032, a trending improvement according to the Treasury figures. Participation rates of working age people are now engaged in the labour market longer. For instance, the number of over 65s in 2002-3 was 125,000. Today, 320,000 people aged 65 and over are working. In 1990, Australia's participation rate for over 55s was below the OECD average of 28% at just 22%. For 2013, it's now above the OECD average of 33.7% at actually 34.9% in Australia. Female participation rates has increased from 67% in 2002-3 to 71% for 2014. And migration numbers have risen from 90,000 a year in 2002-3 to 230,000 a year, with Treasury anticipating a rise to about 250,000 from 2017-18 onwards. Despite these marked improvements, real challenges continue to linger. The dependency ratio remains disturbingly high. The rates of people leaving welfare have declined since the GFC from around 11.8% a quarter before the crisis to around 10% a quarter today. Youth unemployment rates have risen to the highest level since 2001, now sitting at 14%. About half of those who have signed up to apprenticeships and traineeships are completing those courses and programs. The number of long-term job seekers on youth allowance, other, and New Start allowance has blown out since July 2007 from 291,876 to 548,879, noting that around 80,000 people transitioned to New Start from parenting payments in January 2013. Here in Tasmania, the long-term jobless figure is 18,786. And as the end of June 2014, 209,719 people have been on youth allowance other and New Start for 5 years or more. And finally, the average duration on income support is now 230 weeks. In 2007, the average was 196 weeks. So you can see that there are still remaining challenges that we have to meet in this country and indeed in Tasmania. If Australians are to reduce poverty rates, an issue which is clearly close to the heart of TasCOSS and everybody in this room this morning, then we must reduce the number of people on income support who have a capacity to work, as well as the duration spent on income support. As many of you will know, I have a long-standing personal and professional interest in how we can build a better society, and how can we strengthen the institutions of civil society, and how do we strengthen community resilience. And I know I share that interest with all of you because it is you at the front line in providing such important services and such critical support to some of the most vulnerable people in our communities. I believe that improving our society is a role best shared by government, civil society and the community. All too often I hear people proclaim that government must have the answers, that government knows best, that Canberra is responsible for, well, everything. This is simply not true. I see government as an enabler, as the vehicle which can be used to empower you, the members of civil society, to do what you do best, that is using best practice and using the immense experience that you have. It is true that both government and the non-government sectors are facing challenges as our society changes and the sustainability of our current models and systems are tested. The challenge that society faces are real and immediate. We are unfortunately seeing more intergenerational welfare in this country. The reality is that government has financial as well as a social interest in investing in Australians and their well-being. For example, we know that not only does positive family functioning deliver important social benefits to our country, nurturing healthy families also makes a huge difference in lifting our economic productivity. My department's research shows that better family functioning can deliver the economy up to $5.4 billion per annum in increased productivity. And this boost is not just economic. It reflects a stronger, healthier society, less burdened by crime, unemployment, addictions and broken relationships. Conversely, when families and communities struggle, government faces a substantial financial burden as well as the ongoing social burden for individuals, families and communities. The government is tackling these challenges in many ways. Some of the work focuses on intervening early to support people before they encounter trouble. That is why we're implementing a new Families and Communities program that aims to improve financial wellbeing and capability, strengthen communities and support migrants transitioning to life in Australia and ensure that the lifetime wellbeing of families and children is improved. The program provides a broad range of services predominantly focused on prevention and early intervention, including assistance for relationship breakdown. The recently launched Stronger Relationship Trial is just one of a suite of early intervention and prevention activities, something which we're rolling out and we'll be conducting a major conference next year to look at how we can put more emphasis and weight on prevention and early intervention right across the life cycle in terms of the programs which we support. The Stronger Relationships Trial aims to increase the number of couples who participate in education or counselling or parenting programs in order to strengthen their marriage or relationship. And services are currently being delivered by 5 organisations with 24 outlets across the state of Tasmania. We're also leading work to review our welfare system. At the end of last year, I commissioned a welfare review headed by the former head of Mission Australia, Patrick McClure. I tasked the reference group to advise me on how to best support and encourage all people who can work to do so. Further, I asked them to consider what we can best do for people who do not have and will not regain a capacity to work. Importantly, I asked that their recommendations be simple and sustainable to deliver a future for a welfare system that is at once navigable and affordable. In their recently released interim report, they recommended that current payments be simplified and rationalised. They saw a role for direct assistance to disadvantaged groups, whether through employment partnerships with business or helping people manage tasks like balancing their finances or seeking further education. They also foresaw a role for more participation requirements for existing and new activity-tested cohorts. These are areas which the government will consider once we receive the final report, together with its recommendations from Mr McClure and the other members of the reference panel. It is important that we understand that the life trajectories of people who are dependent on welfare payments for extended periods. I believe that the better we understand these groups, the more effectively we're able to intervene and increase their wellbeing, health, and as a result of that, their capacity to work and contribute to society. It's important that we invest early and intensively in people who are able to create real and lasting change in their lives. They need our assistance and it will repay the investment. And as some of you know, one of the things that we've been looking at quite closely is the social investment model, which has been utilised in New Zealand and is now being rolled out beyond welfare to areas such as homelessness and the like. And Mr McClure and the other members of the reference group have been closely looking at that and have been to New Zealand to look at how it operates there. And it may well be that that's part of their recommendations to government when we receive the report in a few years' time, I should say weeks' time, not years. Our interventions need to be tailored to suit individual needs and opportunities, and if we can find a better way to invest up front that has a long-term trajectory that leads people to having the skills, the ability to get jobs and therefore to be able to be part of the broader economic mainstream, then that's better than a trajectory that leads people to long periods of dependency upon welfare. I'm also increasing my department's focus on the critical role civil society plays in our modern day society, because civil society has a long history of responsible governance and management. The government respects and trusts this. And to this end, the government is implementing a broad deregulation agenda to boost productivity by removing unnecessary and overly complex red tape imposed on business, community organisations and individuals by at least $1 billion a year. The government will reinstate the Community Business Partnership, which has served as, in the previous Howard government, a great mechanism to encourage charitable gift giving in this country, and the private ancillary funds which now exist, which in effect invest millions of dollars in social and charitable services in local communities right throughout Australia, was one of the key achievements of that Community Business Partnership in its first iteration, and we hope that that similar sort of work can be done once the new Community Business Partnership gets underway next month. This will serve as a mechanism to stimulate philanthropic activity in Australia and encourage relationships between business and the not-for-profit sector to the benefit of both. Further, the government is abolishing the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission and will establish a National Centre for Excellence for Civil Society. In doing this, what we hope to do is shift the focus of the relationship between government and the civil sector away from compliance and regulation and towards education, support and advocacy. My department is implementing new grant arrangements to bring together 18 grants programs from 5 former departments into 7 broad-banded programs aligned with the priorities of the government. These programs aim to reduce the administrative burden and promote civil society and provide civil society, I should say, with greater flexibility to address the service needs of individuals, families and communities. And notably, 5-year contracts will be offered to most of the organisations who are offered the opportunity to partner with the Commonwealth, which will bring much certainty for the not-for-profit sector in Australia. One of the things I heard loud and clear from your organisations and similar organisations right around this country is that short-term arrangements and contracts with government lead to a great deal of uncertainty, and if there's the ability to provide longer term arrangements, then that makes it easier to employ staff and keep them over a longer term. It makes it easier if you're renting premises, for example, to have better rent deals than you might get if you've only got an arrangement for 1 year, etc. And that's part and parcel of what we're trying to do with these changes. And indeed, the outcome of that grant program round, because I'm sure someone will ask me if I don't say so now, we hope to be able to start announcing in December, certainly before Christmas. And as you know, we continued the current grants until the end of February because we wanted to ensure that services could continue over Christmas and not have, if you were in that unfortunate situation where there wasn't funding, to have a sort of sudden cut-off within a few weeks' notice. So civil society gains its strength and vitality from experience and expertise of organisations like yours that comprise it, and it's something that I personally and more broadly as the government, we wish to continue to support and encourage that sort of activity in the community, and to see that there is proper limits to what government can do, that some things, many things, are best done by organisations on the ground that can respond in a flexible and innovative way wherever possible to the challenges challenges of the communities in which they exist, rather than believing, as I said earlier, that Canberra knows best in relation to how you meet social problems and challenges on the ground in particular parts of Australia. So, ladies and gentlemen, the government is committed to working collaboratively with civil society and in particular working very closely with the social services sector. The role you play, as I said, the work you do and the contribution that you make as organisations in this state is commendable, without which many people would not be in the situation they are, because without your support then they would be clearly worse off than they might be. So thank you for your efforts, and more importantly, thank you for the outcomes which you achieve. I wish you well in this conference and in your continuing work.
Now we've got some time for questions, so I might start off with a couple that have been put forward, and then we'll invite our delegates here to perhaps ask some others as well. One in particular is very pertinent to our state, in the sense that, as you are well aware, and you've said so yourself in your own opening remarks, when it comes to social indicators here in Tasmania, we win them all. We've got the highest unemployment, the highest youth unemployment I should say, and the highest underemployment in the nation. And of course that's coupled with a much higher than the national average dependence on Commonwealth benefits as a principal source of household income. In that context, you can see, I think, the immense concern about any proposition that something like along the lines of 6 months of New Start allowance being taken from someone who's involved in that circumstance in a Tasmanian job market where the jobs are so scarce. We're at a loss to understand how that will help social inclusion, how it will help alleviate poverty. So we'd like a response to that.
Thanks, Tony. The measure is essentially looking at people who are under the age of 30 who are capable of working full-time. So those who are exempted from it would be anybody not capable of working 30 hours or more a week, anybody that's got essentially family responsibilities, people who are in a disability employment service, and a number of other exemptions from it. And indeed there is a provision in the bill that if there are other groups that we may not have been aware of at the time that should properly be exempted, there's power for the Minister to be able to do that. So the point of it is really about those under 30s who are capable of working full-time, and essentially it's a measure to try and encourage them, if they are not working and capable of working and they're not in a job, then to be getting the skills and the training and the education that will enable them to work in the future. And it comes back, I suppose, to encouraging them to take a step which is not going to leave them on income support, not going to leave them on welfare for a long period of time. So that's essentially the rationale, if you like, for the measure. It needs to be seen also in the context of, I think, broader changes that may well occur because of the recommendations from the McClure review. And whilst I'm still waiting on the final report, if the interim discussion paper is some indication of where the McClure Reference Committee will be coming out, then you may recall that there are a number of pillars which they say are important in terms of welfare reform. And it's not just the simplification of the system which they were recommending in the discussion paper, but also the importance of work, the important role that employers play, because we all know that if you're talking, to use the sort of cliched expression, welfare to work, then obviously you need work as part of that configuration, as part of that solution, and that's an important component of this as well.
You can see where the concern comes from, though, in a Tasmanian job market where someone might well have reasonably qualified themselves, perhaps even reasonably re-qualified themselves for work, but in an environment where the jobs aren't there. And it's not a matter of moving from Burnie to Launceston. The jobs are very scarce at the moment in a very difficult jobs environment. So that's part of the problem we have here.
And we understand the situation. We understand, and I do, that there is higher levels of unemployment in Tasmania. There's higher levels of youth unemployment. That's true. The question is, how do we encourage people not to stay on welfare? Because we also know that the longer people stay on welfare, the more likelihood they're going to be on welfare subsequently in their lives. To come back to the New Zealand model, what they've done there
is that they've divided, using actuarial data, their welfare cohort into sub-cohorts, and they've now got about 19 or 20 of them. And to give you an example of how the investment model works there, to take the sort of cliched example of the young person aged 18 or 19 who left school as soon as he or she could, has therefore not completed secondary education, has not got skills, has been on welfare for whatever period of time since leaving school. What the New Zealand data shows is if that person remains there on welfare and you don't intervene, there's about a 70% chance that he or she will be on welfare at the age of 35. Whereas if you can invest in what is needed to get them the skills, and that might include soft skills as well as harder skills, and get them on a trajectory that takes them from skills into work, then that's a better investment. But you've got to have two things to do that. First, you need the data, the actuarial calculations to work out what is the investment to be made. And secondly, you need, as a government, to take a 10, 15-year view of this, not just a 3 or 4 year view, which we tend to take. But the New Zealanders are doing that, and the greatest fan of their system in New Zealand is actually the Finance Minister, who can see the savings to government by making this early investment and different investments in different sub-cohorts of individuals.
I'm sure the community sector will be as keenly anticipating the McClure report as you are, of course. On that report, there was some mention in the interim report, and it's been the subject of a long campaign by the Council of Social Service and the broader community sector, and indeed supported by the Business Council, that the current level of income support in Newstart is so far below the poverty line now that, in fact, not only is it not adequate in terms of day-to-day living, but it doesn't even provide recipients with the extra disposable income that they really need in order to be able to pursue employment. Is there any strategy in place or any thinking about increasing that allowance?
Well, again, we're waiting to see what the reference group says, and I would expect that they will make some reference to adequacy of income support. The other thing in that context, so I'm waiting on that, Tony. The other thing in that context is that I think for far too long we've seen the unemployed as a homogenous group, and we know that they're not. About half of the people who are on Newstart are off it within about 6 months. So you've got that group for whom they may be better skilled, perhaps more highly motivated, circumstances may be better, etc., for whom Newstart is simply a transitional payment, if you like, between finishing study and getting a job, or finishing one job and getting another job. So that's one group. But then there's another group, and that's the group that tend to be there for a longer period of time. And as I said in my speech, regrettably, the numbers in that group have grown over the last half dozen years or so. So what I'm hoping is that part of what McClure looks at and makes some recommendations about is how we might treat or deal with or provide strategies for, again, the different cohorts, and rather than treating everybody who's on Newstart or on an unemployment benefit as just being exactly the same, because quite clearly they're not. And some of that hopefully is reflected in the new job services contracts as well, in terms of where the emphasis is in terms of payment, and therefore the emphasis in terms of those groups of individuals who need the most assistance.
And just a final one from me, then we'll invite some questions from the audience that's been put forward. On the McClure report, a number of people in this room with me were at the roundtable when the Welfare Reform Task Force came to Tasmania. We were very disappointed in the lack of employer engagement in that process. In fact, at our roundtable there was no one from the employer groups at all. Have you been satisfied with the engagement with the employer groups around the nation in terms of the way that reform process has been carried out?
Look, from my understanding from conversations with Mr McClure, he certainly had engagement with the employer groups. I don't know what it was like, at every state that they went to and every round table, but from the conversations I've had so far, he seems to have engendered a fair bit of employer interest in this. I should say in that context that we'll not only be looking at the McClure review, but we're also looking at the same time at the recommendations and the report from Andrew Forrest, which overlaps in some areas as well, Tony. And so the task will be to try and land these reports and their proposals or recommendations on the same page when they come to us. Having said that, I see the process of reform as not being something that's going to happen overnight. I think this is something which was probably a 5 to 6 year agenda. A very practical reason why that's the case is because to make some of the changes that we might want to make will essentially require a new IT system in the Department of Human Services. The current system, frankly, is antiquated. It was built a long time ago. It's just hanging together, but it is not modern enough and it's not flexible enough in its operation to be able to make changes and to be able to make them in some areas quickly. So some of the reform, I suspect, will be over a longer period of time simply because we need a new IT system, and that's probably going to take 3 or 4 years to build in the first place. So I see what comes out of McClure as in part things that we might be able to do more quickly in the shorter period of time. But I think the report, if it reflects some of what's in the discussion paper, will also be a signpost to where we might go over 4, 5, 6 years.
Okay, thank you, Minister. We'll do some questions from the delegates now, and we're going to start over here. If you could just stand up and identify yourself and where you're from and put your question to the Minister.
So my name's Bridget Stewart. I'm representing Waterbridge Grid Co-op. We're a project that's funded by Tasmania Local. Currently, we're funded for 2 years. We're feeling a little...
Here's a microphone, Bridget. Thanks, Meg.
We're funded for 2 years through Tasmania Local. We're feeling a little bit nervous because Tasmania Local gets a new name next year. And with new names could come a lack of funding. So to start my question, and I'd just like to reiterate or repeat the words that I heard at Gough Whitlam's service. We've talked a lot about intervention. Whitlam said he wants to release the talents and raise up the horizons of Australian people. I think this is much more useful language. So what I'm asking is, what assurances can you give me and my project and the 8 other projects around the state that are funded by Tasmania Local currently? They're 2-year funded projects. We're concerned that the second year will disappear. So can you give us any assurance that you will continue the funding promised to the 8 projects, which are building social capacity, improving family well-being, and creating meaningful livelihoods? We're creating jobs for parents, adolescents, and in doing so, creating role models of these adults in the community. We're on the same page. Everyone wants to work. That could be working as a parent, working... If you don't have a cash money job, you might be helping at the community centre, making breakfast for kids in the morning who don't have breakfast before their school. So we're on the same page. We're all about livelihoods. We need to create those. So can you tell me anything about next year for TML?
Did you say they were funded through Medicare Locals?
Tasmania Local.
Right. The Medicare Locals is part of the health funding rather than my portfolio.
Okay.
So I can't answer the question because I don't know the specific details of that, but what I can do is I can take it back to my colleague Peter Dutton,
Great.
the Health Minister, and indicate the concern and ask him to pursue it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was hoping you would say. Thank you very much.
Okay, another question.
So, Minister, would you like to say, well, I'd like you to say something a little bit more about the relationships trial and your expectations of what that might mean for other funding for the sector. So, from the trial into what it might mean around other funding.
Chris Jones is the CEO of Anglicare.
Yes, thanks very much, Chris. The relationships trial, the background to this is a number of things which we've observed happening. One is relates to the trial. I should go back. The trial is to try and encourage couples to participate in one of 3 different areas that would help their relationship: marriage, education, parenting programs that are not just about the parenting but about the relationship itself, and then thirdly, relationship counselling. Because what we've observed is a number of things. One is there is a reluctance in the community to actually go and seek help in these areas. People, I think, believe there's a sort of cultural meme, if I can put it that way, that relationships are private and natural. If they're private, then I don't want to discuss them with other people, and if they're natural, then I just naturally know how to do it, so I don't need help, even if there are challenges or issues that come along. So we're trying to be countercultural, if you like, to give people assistance. And we also know that in the context that is pertinent, coming from an Anglican priest, Chris, that the number of weddings in Australia that occur in a religious setting has fallen over 15 years from 2/3 to 1/3. In other words, 2/3 of weddings now occur in a civil setting rather than a religious setting, rather than in a church or a temple or a mosque or synagogue. And we also know that in relation to the education aspect of that churches more or less encourage couples to go and do some preparation and some education, whereas civil celebrants don't. So looking at all of these issues, the question was, well, if these programs have got value, which a lot of research shows that they do, whether it's education or counselling or parenting programs, how can we encourage more people to do it? And our simple answer to that was, well, if we give them some money, which they can spend on one of these programs, that might encourage more people to go along and do it. So it's early days in terms of the take-up, because just getting the message out, etc., takes a while. I think we're in the order of about 6,000 couples now that have registered for this, and I expect that there will be greater take-up as time goes on. And hopefully from the trial we can learn, because we are having it professionally evaluated by a group from the University of Queensland, we can learn questions like, why do people go along to programs, or why they don't go along to programs, what it is that they thought was useful, what they thought may not be useful in terms of the relationship. So hopefully this will be a learning exercise for us which we can share more broadly as to what will help in these regards. Then in terms of the funding, to come I think to the nub of your question, there is an issue there that if we can attract more people to take up services like that by not only providing block funding but providing a sort of a voucher type approach, which this is, and that does turn out to be bringing more people into services, then we would need to look at whether or not we need some different combination of funding in the future. But that's all part of the evaluation of it to see what works and what doesn't work. So it is very much a work in progress.
Sorry, just perhaps a supplementary question, Minister, then. Some of our clients are struggling about the upfront payment of the $200. Is that sort of feedback coming back through to you as well? Because for some, we're trying to do our work and encourage them, and we've got some people taking it up, but the $200 having to pay up front being a bit of a barrier.
Yes, I actually had a meeting with about 20 providers at the Family Relationship Services Conference in Adelaide last week, and they raised a series of practical issues, including that one, and we've taken all that, we're taking it back and we're having a look at that to see whether or not we can streamline some of the administration of the program. But this was a new trial which was put together fairly quickly. We've tried to make it as simple as possible, but that doesn't mean we always get it right, and some of that feedback, including yours this morning, is something which we will have a look at to see whether or not we can make it easier for couples in that situation.
Okay, got a question here.
Minister, just following on from Chris's question, my name's Kat Faluti-Ball, I'm from Australian Red Cross. Just wondering if this initiative is open to same-sex couples and parents.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Therese?
Hello, Minister. Therese Taylor from Colony 47. You did make the comment that governments don't know all the answers, and I agree with you totally that civil society works best when government, the private sector and the community sector work together. you talked about working in collaboration, and of course we want to do that, but not as the end service provider of a service. And we hear a lot about co-design, and in New Zealand that you quoted, there's plenty of examples also in Britain of co-design. So what's the government doing to have the community sector involved at the beginning of the thinking and not at the end when the policy's formulated, decisions made, and then it's just the delivery of that service?
Hopefully and incrementally we're moving towards greater co-design of programs. It can't happen overnight, but that's the direction I want to go. There's a few things that a few pillars, if you like, of the approach which I'm adopting. One is the value of civil society organisations, and they have expertise that government doesn't have, and we should be providing much more flexibility for innovation at a local level. And that's tied up with the longer term contracts, hopefully more flexibility, the reduction of the number of program areas from 18 down to 7, so they're crossing broader areas, so that gives more flexibility as well. Less red tape and less reporting. We measure whole lots of inputs that frankly go into some cyberspace black hole over Canberra or under Canberra or somewhere, which is probably pretty useless to us and to you as well. And so that's the first thing. Secondly, the social investment, which I talked about, because I think that's the way of trying to actually ensure that you get the best trajectories. Thirdly, we're looking at prevention and early intervention across the life course, and I'll have more to say about this next year. We've funded the Institute of Family Studies to conduct a major one-off conference next year, which will be about prevention and early intervention to try and give it a much bigger boost in terms of the way in which we approach this. But what we're looking at, and this is still a work in progress, so it may change a bit over the coming months as to what it finally looks like, but to give you a sense of where we're trying to go, we're looking at what are the important transition points in life. And you can start in various places, but let me just start with young children. Young children, secure attachment. The psychologists tell us that attachment is important to everything else that's important in life. What happens in the first few weeks, months and years of their life, and then school readiness. So that's a transition point, obviously. Then you can pick other points. It might be life readiness later on. It might be work readiness as a transition point. It may be relationships readiness, which we've sort of been discussing a little bit at the present time. And you can go right through, and then you can get to retirement readiness and ageing readiness. So if you take this life cycle approach, then you can see that there are key transition points for most people. And then we can look at what are the challenges, if you like, what are the problems that might arise at each of those points, and how do we take a prevention and early intervention approach at each of those points. So often when we talk about early interventions, talked about in the context of children and young children, but you could go to the other end of life and have early intervention approaches as well. And in part, the National Disability Insurance Scheme is built on that insurance principle and looking at what you do. But, if you can do something that helps to keep a person, an older person, in their own home for longer, where they usually want to be, rather than being in residential aged care. So if you can work back to what the prevention, the early intervention strategies are for that life cycle change, then you can see that you can take this prevention and early intervention approach right across the life cycle. So that's something or another, a pillar. And then the final one is to pick up something I alluded to, and that is that we want to move to measuring outcomes rather than counting inputs. What works, what programs actually work, and to have an evaluation process built into everything that we do, because if you're running a program, you obviously hope that it's going to have a positive outcome, but we need to be able to measure that better than we do at the present time, and that's going to be part and parcel of the direction we're trying to move. So you can see there's about 4 pillars, if you like, underpinning this approach to social services and to society generally.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to sign up for the ageing readiness course. Down the back.
Jenny Branch-Allen, Chair of Carers Tasmania. I think one of the issues that are sitting in this room, and you talk about this time next year, is some of us are very concerned that we won't be here this time next year. From some of the new models coming from federal government, moving away from block funding, going to client choice, are going to see some of us disappear. And it's not because we're not the right organisations to be in that space. We are doing really good work. We are very client-focused and delivering good services. But the transition from this model to the new model seems to be throwing up some very big challenges for us. And I'm wondering if you recognise and understand that bigger is not always best, and that smaller organisations that are delivering excellent services need to be catered for better in this transition time.
Are you talking specifically about the National Disability Insurance Scheme?
I'm talking about a whole range of areas.
Yes.
Some around in the aged care area, in disability, in carers, in a lot of social programs that exist in our communities.
Well, to answer broadly, there is a very strong desire in the community for what you might call consumer-directed approaches, whether it's disability or care or aged care. There is a strong view in the community, and it's one which I actually support. I think people should have more say in what the outcomes for themselves is. So we are cognizant of that. We have generally we supported the previous government in those directions. So in relation to community care, we're looking at it broadly in relation to residential aged care. I've got a trial going on in South Australia which we've called an aged care innovative hub involving about 10 aged care providers, and that is a work in progress, but also involving the Council on the Ageing as a consumer representative as part of that. You know the work in the NDIS. Yes, we acknowledge that there are transitional issues and they have to be sensitively worked through as best we possibly can. And to come specifically to part of your question, personally, I don't think that bigger is always best. As I said earlier, my view is that local organisations that can meet the challenges that are local are best placed usually, rather than having some monolithic organisation doing it. So in the end that will need to be balanced up, because if you do have a consumer directed care system in which the consumer has much more say over how the dollars are spent, well then obviously that's going to have some market forces at play because of the consumer directing the expenditure of the dollars that may not exist at the present time. But having said that, the aim of this, at least from my perspective, is not to see the end of small organisations. To the contrary, I think small organisations fulfil a very important role in the community.